other glimpses of the real King Charles, we're indebted to another famous name from the era, the diarist Samuel Pepys. It's sometimes forgotten that Charles's reign was blighted by two of British history's greatest disasters, the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666. Pepys recorded both in his famous diary, and it provides us with vivid pictures of a pretty terrible time, and especially Charles's direct and personal involvement.
The plague arrived in 1665. It killed 100,000 people in London, but anyone with any money, i.e. Charles, just got the hell out as quickly as possible. You know, the first signs of the plague, he left with his entire court. He actually abandoned the capital.
People in London knew this. They knew that the king had gone and all the aristocracy. And in fact, there were riots in London during the plague, and people who'd been locked up in their houses with the plague and the Red Cross put on were actually let out, which was against the law. But it was people were fed up with the knowledge that while they were dying in their thousands within the city walls, the king and all his court were carrying on as usual up in Hampton Court or in Oxford.
Thousands of people were dying every single day from the plague, and there was almost nothing that could be done apart from isolating those unlucky enough to catch it. Somewhere had to be found to bury the vast numbers of dead. This is BUNHILL Row Cemetery in the City of London, which was designated as a burial ground for London's increasing number of plague victims. Bubonic plague was a terrible disease that slowly infected the body, covering victims with very painful sores and lesions, gradually draining them of life until they literally rotted away. The plague devastated the population of London.
All over the city, and particularly on its outskirts, as BUNHILL Row is, you've got these frightening lantern-framed pits where the bodies would accumulate, the dead cart would arrive, they'd shoot the bones into the pit. People used to run through the streets screaming and actually kissing people to try and spread the plague, and then they would dive into the bones before they were dead and just wait for death amongst those who were already dead.
There were hundreds of bodies put in there, and often very close to the ground surface, and there was no time to pour quicklime on the bodies or treat them in any way. And it was said at the time that a sweet, sickly smell hung over London because these bodies were everywhere, not far from the surface, rotting.
If the plague wasn't bad enough, Londoners had to endure a second great disaster in 1666. In September that year, a fire broke out at a small bakery in Pudding Lane. At first, nobody seemed unduly alarmed. The Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, famously observed that a woman would be able to douse the flames naturally, so to speak. But the flames took hold, and soon the whole city was burning. Samuel Pepys watched the fire from right here, atop All Hallows by the Tower Church, next to the Tower of London. He wrote, 5th of September, 1666, I up to the top of Barking Steeple, and there saw the saddest sight of desolation that I ever saw. Everywhere great fires, oil cellars and brimstone, and other things burning, the fire being spread as far as I could see it.
Samuel Pepys was the foremost diarist of the age. He leaves an incredibly vivid account of the Great Fire. And he used to climb up All Hallows by the Tower of London and watch just entire streets, buildings, palaces, monasteries just be devoured in one enormous flame. And without his eyewitness account, I'm not sure we'd have such a sort of sound sense of the scale and tragedy of that catastrophe.
As the fire got more out of control, King Charles and his brother James, Duke of York, travelled on horseback to join the fight against the flames. At the end of a long day, the two Royal Volunteer firemen were muddy and sweaty, their faces blackened with smoke.
Charles II really showed what he was made of in terms of being the people's monarch during the Fire of London, when he and the Duke of York went out to the fire directly and literally rolled up his sleeves and tried to help put the fire out.
He went down there, redeemed himself, stood there with Londoners, shared their suffering, came away covered in mud and blood after saving buildings.
If he hadn't got involved, the repercussions would have been huge. He was the leader of the country. He needed to be involved in fighting the Great Fire of London.
Bruce HOAD is a former deputy fire chief who has co-written a book on the Great Fire of London. So is this typical of a 17th century London street?
Well, absolutely typical, other than for the fact that this is built of stone and we'd have been looking at timber buildings then.
But close as that?
Absolutely, yes. Almost touching at the top, and from a firefighter's point of view, an absolute nightmare. Because as we are now, you can only see the length of the alleyway. You don't know what's happening behind you. The fire could be breaking out anywhere.
Yeah.
It would have been incredibly hot and smoky, extremely uncomfortable.
And in terms of casualties, what sort of numbers are we talking?
Well, surprisingly, there were only 6 deaths officially recorded and attributed to the fire.
So in fact, word spread even quicker than the fire?
Yes, it did, and it gave people the opportunity to evacuate and get away from the flames before they were reached.
There were a number of ways to fight fire in the 17th century. So there were fire engines, but they're not fire engines that we would understand today. They were basically carts with huge buckets on the top that you could pump and water would squirt out. Never really enough to fully end a fire.
Charles, James, Pepys, Penn, they were all presented with a fire that was way beyond control at that time. And actually, through effective leadership, they did manage to bring the fire under control, but only when drastic action was taken, and they actually then started to blow houses up with dynamite. And that wouldn't have happened without some firm leadership on the part of Charles and his brother James.